Mark chapter 5. We've talked about the parable of the sower and the seeds last week. The way that different people respond differently to the Word of God. We touched briefly on Jesus calming the sea. I said Mark has the shortest passage on that miracle, and so we'll just run through it quickly. And later on, when we get to the other Gospels, we'll talk about that a little bit more fully. But we leave off with Jesus and the disciples on a boat going across the Sea of Galilee. They leave Capernaum, which is on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, and they're headed to the place of the Gerasenes, which is the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. So they're leaving the Jews, they're going to the Gentiles, the people who aren't Jewish, in the area. Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 1, "And they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately," there's that word, "a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him." Now, one of the things about this area is that it is not only is it Gentile, it's highly pagan. And one of their practices was to build their tombs into the side of a cliff facing the water, because they were a seafaring people. And they believed that that would allow the spirits of the people who they buried to go out to sea. So this man has been living among the tombs. Verse 3, "He had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him." This unclean spirit that this man has given him such superhuman strength that they can't even chain him down. He breaks the chains, he breaks the shackles off his hands and feet. Verse 5, "And constantly, night and day, among the tombs and in the mountains, he was crying out and gashing himself with stones," harming himself. And this is something that we see even in people with mental health issues. That oftentimes they'll believe that there's something inside them that they need to get out. And so they'll cut themselves or burn themselves to try to excise whatever this thing is that's in them. In this case, there is a demon presence in this man. And he knows it. And he's trying so hard to get this demon out. He's cutting himself open with sharp stones. Verse 6, "And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him." Now, we're going to look at 3 different people in this passage. And all of them have that same response. They see Jesus and they bow down before him. They fall down at his feet. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we get further into the chapter. But this goes to show something that we're told later on in the epistles, that we're told, you believe in God? Good, that's good. Even the demons believe and they tremble. They're afraid of him. And we've seen that already when Jesus has driven out the unclean spirit in the man in the synagogue in chapter 2. The demons are afraid of Jesus. They know who he is. Verse 7, crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." This is the first very clear statement of Jesus' deity. And who says it? A demon. They recognize him. They don't care if he's ready to tell people who he is or not. They think they're spoiling the party a little bit by making this public. This is the Son of the Most High God. And it's interesting because Most High God is a Hebrew name for Jehovah. Elohim, the Most High God. That's a specifically Hebrew name. So how does this Gentile man know it? He doesn't. It's the demon that's recognizing who Jesus is. Verse 8, because Jesus had been saying to him, "Come out of that man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, this is a famous line, "My name is Legion, for we are many." That line's famous. It's used in horror movies when someone is possessed by demons, and it's part of the popular culture. My name is Legion, for we are many. In my mind, I'm a grammar guy. I look at that and I go, okay, which is it? My name, singular, is Legion, for we are many. Which one is it? Is it one or is it many? It's an interesting riddle. He says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Verse 10, "And he began to entreat him earnestly not to send them out of the country." Again, he, that is the demoniac, began to entreat Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. Again, which is it? Verse 11, "And now there was a big herd of swine feeding there on the mountain." If you weren't sure whether or not we were in Gentile country, this leaves no argument about the matter. Jewish people would not have been raising pigs. There's a big herd of swine. It's a Gentile country, and pigs are unclean animals, according to Judaism. Uncleanness is going to be another very important thing to see across these three people that we're going to talk about today. Verse 12, "The demons entreated him, saying, 'Send us into the swine so that we may enter them.' And he gave them permission." He gave them permission. People talk about why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow evil to happen? God, Jesus is God, has the authority to tell demons what they may and may not do. He doesn't send them to do it, but he has control. He says, "You may not touch this person," or "Yes, you may touch this person." Why? Because he's God. Don't argue with him. I know that's not a very satisfying answer. It's like when you were a kid and you asked your parents why, and they said, "Because I'm your mother and I said so." Right? It's not a very satisfying answer, but sometimes we do need to just shut up and sit down and say, "Okay, God, you're God, I'm not." Verse 13, "He gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea." These demons drove these pigs to suicide. Why? Because they could. They wanted to do as much damage as they could possibly do. They figured, well, if we drive these swine into the sea, then the farmer is going to get mad at Jesus, and he might kill Jesus over this damage. That's just my take on the situation. That's what I think what might have been in their plan. Verse 14, "And their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and out in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened." Verse 15 is the really cool one. "And they came to Jesus and observed the man who had been," past tense, "demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened." I want you to look back at verse 2 very quickly, where it says that he was a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit. Unclean. That's a legal word from the law of Moses, the ceremonial law. There were some people who were clean and some people who were unclean, and if you were unclean, you were not permitted to enter into the tabernacle or the temple. You were not permitted to do any of the rites of worship of what God commanded in the law. So, why did it matter that this Gentile man was unclean? Why does it matter in verse 15 that now suddenly he is clean? He wasn't Jewish. He would have been unclean anyway. Gentiles weren't allowed in the tabernacle either. They were only allowed in the outer court of the temple. So why did it matter if he was unclean or clean? I think it's because Jesus was saying something about who he came to serve. He wasn't here just for the Jewish people. And we're going to see later in another miracle Jesus comes right out and says, I didn't just come for the Jewish people. I came for everyone. So this man who had been unclean, he had had an unclean spirit. Now, verse 15, they observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed and in his right mind. He's clean now. And they became frightened. What are they scared of? It's like what I said during the episode of the storm at the sea. Jesus says, what are you guys scared of? This is a wondrous thing, isn't it? They're frightened. And those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to entreat him to depart from their region. They're so scared of him, they're going to run him out of town. Why? Because he drove this demon out? Because this large number of pigs was slaughtered? They're scared of him because they don't understand what he is. Verse 18, and as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was entreating him that he might accompany him. And Jesus did not let him. But he said to him, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. I want you to notice this. He says, what great things the Lord has done for you. And that word Lord, the Hebrew word is Jehovah. It is the literal name of God revealed to Moses. The Lord has done these great things for you. Verse 20, and he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, which is the capital of that region, what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Jesus says, tell everyone what great things Jehovah, the Lord, the God of Israel, has done for you. He goes and tells everyone the great things Jesus has done for him. That is a proclamation of the deity of Christ. It's clear now. Even this Gentile man who had been demon-possessed understands it. Jesus is the God of Israel. He is Jehovah. So we have one example now of someone who had been unclean and is now clean and who has faith in Jesus Christ. Verse 21, through the end of the chapter, we're going to see two more miracles and two more people who through faith go from being unclean to being clean. Verse 21, and when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, the Jewish side, a great multitude gathered about him. They'd been waiting for him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials, you can't get much more Jewish than that. He's one of the men who is in charge of the synagogue. His name is Jairus, came up, and upon seeing him, fell at his feet. There it is again. He sees Jesus, and he bows down. He falls at his feet. And entreated him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her. That's going to become important, the laying on of hands, that she may get well and live. That's faith. To come up to a man you don't know, you've heard things about him, and say, I believe that if you come and just lay hands on my daughter, she'll be healed. Verse 24, and he, that is Jesus, went off with him, that is Jairus, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. Now, yesterday there were a lot of people here for the memorial service, and there were times during the calling hours as people came in the back door and around the front to see the family that people were pressed in together a little bit, pressing in on each other. And, you know, you've been in a crowd, you jostle, you touch a little bit, you bump elbows. People were pressing in on Jesus. It's a great crowd, a great multitude. It's like walking down the street in Manhattan. I remember we would go to Manhattan for Broadway shows when I was in college studying theater. And we'd have time before the show to walk around the city, do some shopping, things like that. And I remember what it's like trying to cross the street, especially in Times Square. I used to wear a jacket with zip pockets to keep my wallet and my phone in because, someone gets close to you and bumps into you, suddenly your wallet's gone. I used to carry my cards in one wallet and my cash in another wallet so that if I lost one, I'd still have the other. People were pressed in. I have no idea how many people I've come in physical contact with just walking through Times Square. So they're pressed in on Jesus. Verse 25. And a woman who had had a hemorrhage, the literal Greek is a flow of blood, for 12 years, and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse, after hearing about Jesus, came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. This is a woman who has had this physical ailment for 12 years straight. Every day, pain and hemorrhaging. And she had seen the physicians of her time, and they could not help her. All they did was make it worse. I imagine they probably gave her herbal medications that they said would help, and instead it just made things worse, made her feel more ill. I imagine at the time they probably tried leeching or bloodletting, like that's going to help. She'd spent every penny she had trying to find a cure for this. And then one day, in a great big crowd, she sees Jesus rushing through the crowd to get to this poor young girl who is dying. And she said to herself, verse 28, if I just touch his garments, I shall get well. Again, that's faith. She doesn't know who Jesus is. She's heard about him, it says in verse 27. She sees him there. He's walking through the crowd. She is an unclean woman because of her flow of blood. She's a woman in that time period, touching a man's cloak that she doesn't know. Everything about this situation says she should be dragged down a side street and stoned to death, according to the law of Moses. Watch what happens instead. Verse 29. And immediately she touches his garment. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. She touches the hem of Jesus' cloak, and she goes from unclean to clean immediately. And immediately, verse 30, Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, he could feel that some of his healing power had gone out of him, turned around into the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? He was probably being touched by a lot of people all the time as he's walking through the street. But he noticed one particular person touched him, and he felt healing power go out of him. And he knew, someone touched me and was healed. Who was it? Verse 32, and he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and, what? She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. All three of these people, an unclean Gentile, a synagogue leader, and an unclean woman, they all fall down before Jesus, fearing and trembling. Verse 34, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Not touching my garment made you well. Not coming in contact with me made you well. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Jesus is saying, this isn't temporary. This isn't just another one of the physician's, herbal cures or whatever. No, go in peace and be healed permanently. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, They came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" That word teacher in Hebrew is rabbi. They recognized Jesus' teaching authority as a rabbi. Your daughter's dead. Jesus stops in the street to talk to this woman that's been healed, and in that time, he might have gotten to Jairus' daughter in time to save her life. But you don't hear Jairus complain about it. Instead, verse 36, Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." He's asking for more faith. And he allowed no one to follow with him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. I call them the three amigos, Peter, James, and John. They were the three closest disciples to Jesus. They're the three who go in to this little girl's bedroom with Jesus. They're the three that go up and see Jesus transfigured, and the prophets gathered around Jesus on the Mount of Olives. They're the three that he trusts to stand watch while he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, even though they don't do a very good job of that. These are the big three, Peter, James, and John, the three amigos. They come with him. And they came to the house of the synagogue official. Now, Mark could have written Jairus' name over and over again. But instead, he chooses to say the synagogue official most of the times that he refers to Jairus. It's important that we remember who Jairus is. And we'll see why in just a minute. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he beheld a commotion, people loudly weeping and wailing. These were professional mourners. This was, and still is in some parts of the world, a very old tradition. Yes, you had the family who were actually grieving the loss of a loved one, but they or the city would hire professional mourners to come out and gather around the house and cry and wail loudly. And it was like a church ringing the church bell to tell the community that the service was starting. It was to tell everyone in the community that could hear someone has died. So you've got this commotion of people loudly weeping and wailing. And Jesus enters in the house, verse 39. He said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? This child has not died, but is asleep." And I think that the translators of the NASB rhymed that intentionally, because when I looked in the Greek, there are a lot of other ways to write that didn't necessarily rhyme. But he says, what are you mourning for? Nobody died in this house. She's just asleep. Verse 40, and they began laughing at him. That's bitterness. That's a lack of faith. They began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he shoves them all out of the house. He took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. Now, I want you to remember what Jairus asked Jesus to do when he first came and fell at Jesus' feet. He said, "Come to my house and lay your hands on my child, and I believe she will be healed." And while the child was alive, it would have been perfectly normal for Jesus to do that. Even in that day, the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, was to lay hands on sick people and bless them. While the child was alive, it would have been totally normal for Jesus to lay hands on her. But the child is dead now. Verse 41, and taking the child by the hand, Jesus said to her, "Talitha cumi," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Jesus just made himself unclean ceremonially by touching a dead body. Now, yes, there were people in the Jewish society of the time who were undertakers and that would prepare the body for burial, and they would become unclean ritually, and then they would have to go and cleanse themselves in order to be clean again so that they could continue to worship in the temple. But a rabbi intentionally making himself unclean by touching a dead body? That was unheard of. And he did it right in front of Jairus, who Mark has been diligent in reminding us is a synagogue official. This isn't a situation where Jesus can just say, well, nobody saw me do it, so I guess it's okay. Jairus is right there in the room, and Rabbi, Jesus, takes this dead girl's hand and makes himself unclean. He says to her, Talitha Kuma, which is Aramaic, the language that Jesus and his apostles would have spoken. It's a mix of Hebrew and Syrian, and it's the kind of the grandfather language of modern-day Arabic. And Mark is kind enough to provide us with the Greek translation so that we can have an English translation. Translated means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Verse 42, and immediately the girl rose and began to walk. And my translation says for, or because she was 12 years old. It actually probably ought to read, and she was 12 years old. It's a qualifier. It's saying she was a little girl, but she was old enough to get up and do things in the house. She wasn't, this isn't a toddler that we're talking about. And immediately they were completely astounded. Everyone in the room, Peter, James, John, Jairus' wife, probably the little girl is pretty shocked too, They're completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he said that something should be given her to eat. And this last verse, verse 43, really interested me when I was researching it. So first he says, no one should know about this. It's funny because he told the Gentile demoniac, after he was cleansed, to go and tell everybody about it. So what's the difference? Why is he letting the Gentile world know who he is, but not the Jewish world? There are a few opinions on this. One opinion is that what Jesus really means is just don't tell anybody about the resurrection of this little girl, because I'm not ready for people to understand that level of my power yet. I say, I'm not sure I buy that. Another opinion on this is that he wants the Gentile world to start to know who he is before the Jewish side of the world knows who he is, because he knows that he must be crucified at the end of the story. And if the Jewish people figure out too early who Jesus is, the Pharisees are going to get him for their supposed blasphemy too early, and he won't do the things that he knows he needs to do leading up to the crucifixion. I think that's probably a better explanation. The second thing I noticed at the end of verse 43, he said that something should be given her to eat. And I did a little cross-referencing. And everywhere in the Bible that a person is raised from the dead, they eat something. Why is that? You could go with the physical medical explanation that, well, they've been dead for a little while and their body has stopped, the metabolism has stopped, so they need to eat something to get their metabolism going again. I say, yeah, okay, maybe. I think the better explanation is that it's a proof that they really are alive. Jesus, after his resurrection, he goes and sees the disciples in the upper room and he asks them for something to eat to prove that he's really alive, that he's not a ghost. He's really alive. He can eat physical food. You can touch him. He's the same living Jesus Christ. I think it's the same reason here. He wants everyone to see this girl is really, truly alive again. She's eating. She's up. She's walking around. You can touch her. She's alive. It's also interesting that the third person who is unclean in this passage, we don't hear whether or not that person becomes clean again, right? The demoniac, we hear he has an unclean spirit, and then we hear he's cleansed. The woman with the issue of blood, she's unclean. She touches Jesus' garment and is healed. She's clean. Jesus touches the dead girl's body. He's unclean. We don't hear anything about whether or not he becomes clean again. And I think that this is a representation of who Jesus is, just as much as the other examples are an example of his deity. This is also an example of his deity. Jesus doesn't have to be made clean again because he's God. God is the one that you need to be clean in front of. Being clean in the Jewish context is not about being clean in front of everyone else. It's about being ceremonially clean before God, so that you can go before God in the temple. Jesus is God. He doesn't have to prove anything to himself. So we don't ever see anything about Jesus becoming clean again. We know that he becomes unclean when he touches the little girl's body, but we don't see anything about him having to go through any process to become clean again. Faith in the deity of God takes uncleanness and turns it to cleanness. Jesus' own divine authority defines what cleanness is. And you say, okay, Mark, but none of us are Jewish. None of us have to worry about being ceremonially clean. We don't have to worry about the ceremonial or civil sides of the law of Moses. We still ought to follow the moral side of the law of Moses. But the ceremonial stuff, this clean or unclean, we don't follow that anymore. We're in the age of grace. God's grace makes it so that we don't have to worry about the law. Okay. But there is still a difference between being unclean and being clean, even for Gentiles, even for Christians today. We have, all of us, uncleanness in us. When you're unsaved, before you come to Christ, that uncleanness, you can't get it off. It's like Lady Macbeth washing her hands in Shakespeare's play, out spot. She imagines that there's this red mark on her hand from the blood of the king that she helped her husband murder. She's washing her hand, out damned spot. Come clean. But it won't come clean. That's our lives before Christ.